a couple of days ago. So I'm glad that you found us here. Hopefully it was the one at the end of the Google form, and I emailed it to you. So if you didn't get either of those things, but you're still here, amazing. Super appreciate you. My name is Meredith White, and I teach just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. And we are, I should have counted. This is like 11 maybe into our series that'll go all the way through, Joe, when's yours? 2nd of June, 3rd of June, like right past Memorial Day. Does that sound right? Yeah, okay. I need you to know, and I need you to be ready. No, just kidding. So we'll be going here for a while. So tonight we have Stacey. Stacey and I used to be, well, I was in Clarksville, Stacey. So how far? It's like 45 minutes away, right? I was just north of you at Vanderbilt.
But I think when you were at Clarksville, I was in Memphis, though.
Yeah. And then I moved to Memphis, and then I think you were in Nashville.
Yeah.
Oh, listen, it was like who were we just talking to Tuesday? Oh, Daphne Warren. We were in Memphis at the same time, and then I moved here. We moved like after we had both met, but we were both in Memphis at the same time. So she moved to Texas, and I moved back to Atlanta, and it was like, oh, why didn't we hang out? And like Paul Jenneman, I saw Paul Jenneman more like other places than I ever did when we were in Memphis together for like 3 years. I was like, I have to go to, New York to see Paul Jenneman. Ridiculous, but we all kind of zigzag around. So yay, so we're gonna rock and roll, and I'm gonna make sure that everything is good here so we don't get interrupted. There we go. Yeah, so we should be good. Sorry, the Zoom's on lock. I keep my Zoom a tomb because the things happen, right? So I'm excited to get started. Stacey, do you mind telling us what you're up to these days? I just mentioned that you're in Nashville, but what else?
Yeah, so I live and work in Nashville, Tennessee at Vanderbilt University.
Woo.
Work at the Center for Teaching, which is a staff position where I support people who are teaching with technology or people who are teaching languages all across campus. I also teach in that role. Right now I'm teaching a graduate course in second language acquisition, and in the fall I'm teaching Spanish 1. And I think those might be my 2 favorite courses to teach. And I also do research. So, I have, my research is probably interesting in its scope because my role is a little bit non-traditional. So I don't have to live by some of those traditional norms that journal articles are the most important thing. So I have a podcast called We Teach Languages where I try to disseminate interviews with language teachers. Maris Hawkins is the sort of co-pilot on the podcast. And I also do a lot of Twitter scholarship, if that makes sense, but talking to actual teachers in the real world and talking through ideas in real time on Twitter, in addition to doing things like book projects and journal articles and other things that honestly just make me very happy. I have a really cool job. I get to do really interesting work. And the focus of a lot of that work is either teaching with technology, which has been very relevant in the past year, or teaching through critical approaches, which has also been really relevant. It's been a busy year.
I was going to say, so you're not busy at all. No.
Yeah. I look forward to nothing interesting happening regarding technology or social justice for the next few years.
Nobody needs me for anything. Okay.
No, that's not going to happen. I think it's actually a wonderful turn of events that these topics are really mainstream and we're all talking about them together. So.
Absolutely. I know when I was doing my specialist, there were so many things that were like, such and such critical theory, such and such critical theory. And I feel like what you do is so important because, like you said, it's connecting to that practical classroom piece. I would have to read those definitions like 75 times. And I'm like, I feel like this should be simpler, but it like, and then I read back over it like, so see, and I was like, oh my God, like this is a lot. But that practical piece, I think, as just only ever having been a practicing classroom teacher was kind of what I would like. There was a disconnect 100% between some of the other people, and some of us that are in classrooms, if that makes sense. So it was like connecting. Yeah. I felt like I needed to connect up with a lot of those like critical approaches and just the vocabulary, which was hard. But
yeah, and I think that's actually one of the things that I want to talk about tonight too is just what it means to be critical. And I won't be able to always keep up with what happens in the chat, but I know everyone else, Meredith will help me figure out. I just love to be interrupted, and it would be ideal if this conversation goes in a different direction than what I imagine.
Totally.
So I'm going to start. Is it okay, Meredith, if I jump in?
100%.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Will you buy me a couple of minutes? Just not a couple minutes, like 10 seconds to get this.
Oh, I dropped the link to the podcast in the chat too. So if you're not,
thank you.
familiar with the podcast, so good. Oh, I think you were actually one of the first that I started subscribing to. Like whenever I started paying attention to, podcasts, and also like carving time. Like that's the kind of, we were tweeting about boundaries the other day or yesterday, whatever. All the days feel the same. And one of them was, I got talking with a friend of mine about like, how, like, when do you consume the things you consume? And one of the things that I've started really looking forward to is just podcasts on the way to work, which means that I don't know any new music, which is like, my students say things, I'm like, wow, that's probably totally inappropriate. No idea what that means. Like I'm so not.
I'm out of the loop.
I'm up on my podcasts. So, yeah.
Right. Well, I have not been back to an office since March of last year. So I already was at a point just from producing a weekly podcast. I do about half of the interviewing and all of the editing work and production work, and a routine of listening to my own podcast over and over to edit and produce it sort of turned me off podcasts. So I used to be a really big podcast person until I started producing one. And then I just didn't have the energy to listen to them anymore. And now that I have been taking a break from my own podcasts, we're producing episodes at a much slower rate, like one every few months.
Absolutely.
Just because of how busy everything is, and also not having a commute into work. So I don't actually get to listen to them hardly at all. So I might be ready to become a podcast person again.
Yeah.
That might be the next step. Okay. So one of the things when you talk about critical approaches to language teaching, one of the issues that comes up is all the different ways we use critical that aren't necessarily related to the term the way I'm going to talk about it. Completely legitimate uses of the word, but I think it's important to be clear. When I talk about critical approaches to language teaching, it's a specific subset of ways of approaching reality and interpreting reality. It's not necessarily related to the word criticism, although I think actually criticism is really awesome and we could use a lot more generous, helpful criticism, good faith criticism. But when we say someone is overly critical, meaning they criticize people too much, that's not this, because pointing out people's flaws isn't the same as taking a critical approach. It's also not necessarily the same as a lot of educational uses of critical thinking are really about like learning problem solving and learning to try multiple approaches and take failure well. And this isn't necessarily related to that sort of use of critical thinking either. What I mean is when I take a critical approach to language teaching, or when I say an approach to language teaching is critical, I'm saying that it acknowledges and explores different perspectives. Okay. I know I'm not in present mode. Does it need to be bigger for y'all to see it better? I can put it in present mode if that would help. I'll go ahead and do that. Okay. No, you have it on my tabs open up there. So it acknowledges and explores different perspectives. In order for something to be critical, it can't just take a single view. I can't be critical and only see things through my first person perspective and not be able to acknowledge and even explore other ways of looking at the same situation. An approach that is critical questions previously held assumptions. So if I am doing language teaching in a way that is critical, then I am questioning my own assumptions. I'm leading my students to question their assumptions. And the work we're doing is helping us to uncover what is sort of the stuff we come into the classroom with, and how is it affecting the way we're interacting with the content. It also challenges the status quo. So there's a lot of things that seem like common sense, things that seem, I actually am not a fan of common sense at all. I think it usually means we're stuck in mental models and routines that need to be challenged. And so critical approach challenges the status quo. The status quo doesn't always need to be changed, but it does always need to be challenged. And I also mean that a critical approach encourages both the student and the instructor to choose to think and act in a new way. A lot of what we do with language and culture is just automatic. It's just implicit. We're just doing the thing that comes next because that's what feels like it comes next. And making a choice to consciously think and act in new ways is what I mean by critical. The University of Waterloo has a definition of critical thinking that I think is useful for this aspect, or I'm sorry, of critical reflection, which is that critical reflection is a process of identifying, questioning, and assessing our deeply held assumptions about our knowledge, about the way we perceive events and issues, our beliefs, feelings, and actions. And so up front, that might not seem to have a huge connection to language teaching. However, there's a few pieces of terminology that I want to tie together. And then after we kind of get through this theoretical piece, we'll look at some examples of what this looks like. But I often use the term mental models to describe the way that we interact with reality. I walk around taking in information through my senses all day long. And the only way that information makes sense is if I can process it through a mental model of how I expect the world to work. Every single time I see a fire hydrant, I can't go into a long mental process to try and figure out what that object is. I have to be able to see a fire hydrant and immediately know what it's for and what it does, and that I'm not supposed to park next to it. That has to be an easy connection for my brain to make, that this category of object is shaped like this, it has a color like this, and this is how you interact with it. Those mental models, when people study abroad, are intensely challenged, which is one reason why study abroad can be such a transformative experience, because maybe the fire hydrants are a different shape and color. Right. Maybe the rules about how close you can park to them are different. So everything we think we know about reality has to be reevaluated. Our assumptions about the little things and the big things have to be challenged. Some of y'all might have heard a similar term, mental representation. This is used a lot in second language acquisition to say that when students are taking in input in the language, their brain processes that input to build a mental representation of language, a mental representation of grammar. This is exactly the same as a mental model. One of the things that drives me crazy actually is when SLA researchers say language is different from other kinds of learning. Actually, our brain builds mental models for everything. It's always building mental models. And when we take in input, our brain is trying to build mental models. It's trying to create knowledge out of that language, just like it's trying to create implicit knowledge out of fire hydrants or out of any other experience. Now, what happens with critical language teaching is that we get, by the time we're adults or by the time we're adolescents, really, we are so entrenched in our mental models, it is actually hard for us to see the world in a different way. We have what in my field is called a meaning perspective. And the meaning perspective is our mental model, it is our representation, but it literally determines how we interpret reality, how we make sense of things. Terms like acquisition and socialization are also used to describe this process. But it's just the way the brain works. We take in discrete data. Our brain tries to piece that data together to make a big picture. And then instead of evaluating all the data we get from then on out and really focusing on it, we just sort of try to make sense of the data that we see through our senses, just like we do with language, where it just sort of goes in, we make sense of it through our mental model, and we don't have to analyze it too much. I think you can see this is where things kind of get tricky, because if we're just taking things in and not analyzing them too much, the racism and the sexism and the classism and the linguicism, all the things that are also in our environment that we've been socialized into are also just part of our mental model. Yeah. No one's interrupted me yet, right? Because feel free, go ahead, just say what you want to say. I've been talking a long time already.
I know, I'm thinking too, because I hadn't made that connection of the mental models and that being what can be so like jarring about a study abroad experience or something that's really deeply culturally embedded that and like tied to our value system, like, no, that's not the way that goes, like, because that's not what that means to me. And I don't think I've connected those two in that way before. And that's really wow, like that's important.
I like the terminology you use, that it's deeply culturally embedded too, because some parts of our mental model are connected to how we feel about ourselves, about our families, what we think is important. So I have some tweets. I'm going to show you some tweets. These are from 20th. You guys remember January 20th? It was just a few days ago, but it feels like last year already. Jennifer Lopez sang "This Land Is Your Land" during the presidential inauguration and said a few words in Spanish in the middle. And there was a lot of very complimentary things said on social media about great representation, go J-Lo. But there was also quite a bit of backlash, and some of into these categories. One of my favorite things about these tweets, and I really do find these tweets endearing, and I know that's a horrid thing to think, but these are people opening up their brains on social media and giving us access to their mental models. These are people who find themselves in a situation where the way they make sense of reality, their mental model for language and culture and multilingualism it doesn't fit with this experience they're having. They're experiencing disorientation and they have negative emotions and they're lashing out as a result of it. So the first person here represents a huge category of people who talked back to J-Lo.
Wow.
This is America, we speak English. This is super common. Every time there's an example of multilingualism in the public sphere, especially if it's any sort of a patriotic connection, people come out to show us that they have a mental model that there's a one-to-one correlation between America and English. The Venn diagram is a perfect circle. If you're in America, you speak English. If you speak English, you're in America. Those things are besties. This obviously is an untrue fact. This is just like in reality provable as not true. America has never been an exclusively English-speaking country. We don't have an official language. Many people in the United States don't speak or understand English. None of this is factually accurate, but that doesn't actually matter with a mental model. A mental model helps us make sense of reality. It doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And so this is a very common sentiment. The next person kind of takes it up a notch. She's not just saying that this is America, speak English. She's saying, I have no idea what J-Lo just belted out in Spanish. Try communication with everyone. Because this is telling me that English is a universal language that we use to communicate with everyone. And other languages are exclusive just for certain groups. And those are groups she's not a part of. I mean, really, for her, she is angry because someone is threatening her mental model of whether or not she's allowed to be part of this American club. They're using an exclusive language that she doesn't have access to. She feels threatened. She feels angry. She's lashing out. The third one is maybe my favorite of all three, because this is so complex. We see both of the previous sentiments. Speaking Spanish at the American presidential inauguration, right? America doesn't go with Spanish. We got that. Not everyone speaks Spanish, right? It's an exclusive language and you're leaving me out of your exclusive club if you speak it. But the final one is it was sad and it shows a low education. Y'all, like as language teachers, how many years of my life did I spend in formal and informal education in Spanish? Lord have mercy. But you know, she wasn't talking to me, a white woman who learned Spanish as a second language. This is talking about racialized people speaking languages that belong to their communities
Right.
as not having the prestige. So in these 3 tweets, we have learned that this mental model that people are bringing to the language classroom, or in this case to the inauguration, is that English belongs to America and vice versa. Spanish is an exclusive language that is not for everybody. And people who are multilingual have a lower class status, lower educational status than people who are monolingual in English.
Oof,
So that's a lot, right? How about this?
goodness.
This is just a few headlines I clipped about people getting yelled at in public. This is a little clip from an article about how for 4 years under our previous president, there was no Spanish language section of the whitehouse.gov pages.
Right.
That it was specifically because that president believed in the US, we have to speak English. This is a country where we speak English, not Spanish. I mean, y'all, these prevailing ideologies, these prevailing mental models have teeth. They affect policy. They have effects on multilingual people's lives. And then this one I just clipped out because this has been happening for hundreds of years. This isn't like new in the last 4 years with the previous administration. This has always been here. This is a story about Native American children who are ripped from their families, put in boarding schools, and forced to learn English and to abandon their native language and culture. And these took place up until the 1970s, through the mid-1800s till the 1970s. This isn't just like the current zeitgeist. This is a mental model that's really defining in our country and is part of our historical trajectory. So as a teacher, if I'm bringing a critical lens to my classroom, one of the first things I have to do is recognize that my students also bring this mental model. So a quote from a student named Ten, who is part of a research project I did over 10 years ago. And he says, I thought someone who is teaching in an American school should have English as their first language. I know that sounds ignorant, but with the accent, it's like I have to do a little bit more work to understand what she says. When I shouldn't have to. Other than Spanish, which I have to figure out, I also have to play with their English. So he's like even upping the game, not just speak English, but speak English as a native speaker. No accents that show that you're a multilingual speaker. Only monolingual is allowed here. Here's something else Ten said in that study. I used to get really mad when I'd be driving around and I'd see a billboard in Spanish. Why would he get really mad? Because it felt like a threat. Why does it feel like a threat? Because he identifies as this city belonging to him. And if someone else is allowed to speak their exclusive language in his city, then it doesn't belong to him. It doesn't make sense in his mental model. So he worked at the zoo, and when the kids came in, he'd be talking to them because the parents don't effing speak English. I used to get really annoyed when I'd see a commercial in Spanish. You know, the last time I checked, this was the United States of America. So just to be clear, speak English. We yell at Latina shoppers. This is America. We speak English, we say to J-Lo. And this student, speak English. This is America. His teacher did not know that he brought these mental models into her classroom. He never told her. He never communicated any of this to her. I was the researcher, so I was interviewing him in a way where all of this came out. She also never knew that her class was helping him to reevaluate all of these ideas, realize that he was carrying really unhealthy mental models into his life experiences.
Wow.
Figure out ways, let me stop the share there. Figure out ways that he could interact with the world in a different way. By the time his first semester Spanish course was over, he was making efforts to reach out to people in his workplace that he thought might be multilingual, ask them what languages they spoke, learn some words from them, practice his Spanish with them. His mental models were completely transformed as he learned language. When I say a critical approach, I mean an approach to teaching language where someone like Ten comes into my classroom with the mental models, because those things were socialized into them. We acquire them as we acquire our native languages. So someone like Ten comes into my classroom, and instead of feeling angry, like those people on Twitter, instead of lashing out against multilingualism, he slowly learns to challenge his own assumptions, to see things from other perspectives, and to do the work necessary to transform his mental models and see the world in a new way.
Oh, I think of it like next to, you know, it's almost the reverse, like what we're seeing in those tweets. It's almost like the reverse of what we tell students. The value of languages, your
Mm,
community will open, you'll be able to talk and connect with so many more people. And not the opposite, but it's almost like they go together, because those people who are seeing the billboards and, like he said, can't talk to the parents, like they're acutely aware of the fact that they like do not have access to those messages, and like you said, are lashing out because now I don't know what's going on. You know,
mhm.
I'm not in that club.
That
And
is upending the hierarchy of my
yeah,
language being dominant. And my
yeah.
mental model tells me that my language has to be dominant.
Hmm.
So it's really interesting you say that, because all the research that we have done in the field shows us that you cannot pick up this sort of transformation. You cannot do this sort of critical work incidentally.
Mm.
Happen by accident. So back in 1997, Michael Byram wrote a book called Teaching and Assessing Intercultural Communicative Competence. One of the points he makes in that book is it has to be intentional, it has to be incremental, and teachers are responsible for whether or not they include the practices that work.
Mm.
Anyone who tells you that you will naturally become more sensitive as you learn more languages actually hasn't read the research,
Right.
because we know that people actually, if their mental model includes any sort of a dominant narrative about their native language and culture, which most of ours do, like mine definitely has, and I'm constantly working on that to evaluate how that has its little tendrils in the way that I interact with people.
Mm.
Um, so if your mental model for language and culture has that dominance narrative anywhere in there, being exposed to more languages and more cultures will not automatically make you more open. It will make you more closed. It will make you double down on those beliefs, and it will cause you to lash out at people who challenge them.
Wow. Absolutely. I know that I for sure have done, you know, over the years you do different things to like recruit students in your program, especially if you're a singleton teacher, whatever. And we've you know, especially I don't know, I don't think we've done it in recent years, but maybe we have too. That's sometimes one of those like hook lines, you know, is like
Mhm.
learn at our school we have block scheduling, so students can they pretty frequently take more than one language because they have room for that in their schedule. You can take like through French AP and still have one more year of high school, so it's really cool.
Mhm.
So we'll have some like multilingual students take multiple languages. And you know, what an easy tagline, right? Like learn languages, it'll make you more open-minded. Learning languages is, you know, a bar in and of itself. Learning languages,
Ooh, that's a
yeah,
tough one. Yeah.
it's a tough one, right? And it's super easy for that to be the default. Like, well, how could it not be? But like, yeah, it could 100% just reinforce all the stuff you're already thinking. But
Yeah. So in a
but
previous presentation that you were actually at, Meredith, that I did with LJ, one of the
yeah,
examples we brought up was a lawyer in New York City who was caught on social media on YouTube yelling
yes,
at Spanish speaking staff in a restaurant.
yeah,
And when they dug into his background a little bit, it turned out not only is he a lawyer, which means he has a lot of education, but his firm also advertised that they take on Spanish speaking clients and they're a multilingual firm, which is just like, it is possible to take all the required courses, get through an entire higher education, even understand
mm,
the economic utility of multilingualism, but still not let go of that narrative that my language and culture are universal and normal and common sense. And when other people employ their language and culture in public settings, they're
mm,
excluding me and they're reducing my membership in this community.
mm.
That's something that we have to work on. So, back to the definition of critical, it is possible for language and culture study to do all that stuff. Like it is possible to teach languages, which a lot of the people in your series have gone into a lot of depth about, to teach in a way that's trans inclusive and representative of different racial and ethnic identities. And like there's a lot of good that can come out of language study.
Mhm.
But there are things that you have to do to be critical to help students evaluate their assumptions, to think through why they believe what they believe, and to honestly engage with perspectives that are different from their own.
Yeah. Well, and like exactly like you said, like it's, and I think it was Kelly mentioned that in the chat, but it's come up in previous ones and you know, whatever, a million conversations before that. it's delightful when, you know, like a white child in a DLI program, or, you know, oh, Meredith, Joe, Stacey, you guys where'd you learn Spanish? Like, that's like, oh, that's so nice. But then somebody else does, you know, a Black and brown person is maybe, you know, has a different first language or whatever. And it's immediately like that deficit mindset for a lot of people, not always, but for a lot of people in a lot of ways. And that's, or, you know, nobody asks me why I don't speak Irish or, you know, Gaelic or Welsh, you know, they're not like, where are you from? You know, that kind of thing. It's just like generally accepted. And I had a conversation with a couple of friends, couple of language teacher friends recently. They were trying to think of icebreakers, red flag, right? Like, no icebreakers, please, ever. It was like second semester icebreakers. I'm like, don't do any icebreakers, are the worst. No, I'm kidding, but I really do hate icebreakers. One of them was like names, like, oh, you know, if you have like an unusual name, we can maybe talk about what it means. And I'm like, no, that's such like, because you're not going to say like John, Timmy, you know, Mary, like, what does your name mean? You're going to otherize these students in your class you think should.
The whole concept of unusual
100%
displays your mental model, right? Like,
right.
What is normal? What is unusual? That it's only possible for us to have a definition of those things if we have a shared mental model.
Exactly.
I want to point to something in the chat that I just saw. One person said that this is really linked to the idea of patriotism in the USA, and that is absolutely true. Yeah. But I also want to emphasize that this is in no way limited to our context. I feel very comfortable speaking on this context because I was socialized into the US context, and I have spent years trying to change the way I interact with the world, or at least become less problematic over time as I have these sort of gut reactions and knee-jerk impulses to things that happen in the world. But I also follow a lot of people on social media who are having similar issues in their home countries. So one person I follow on social media is an Irish person of Vietnamese descent, and she is an advocate for the Irish language, the Gaelic Irish. And she is bombarded almost constantly with really racist messages from people who are also advocates of Irish, because they don't think she is Irish enough to be an advocate of Irish because she's of Vietnamese descent. Sheesh. And this is nothing against Ireland. Ireland is a wonderful place, and they've got a lot of language stuff together, but they're not exempt. Just They have mental models about Irishness, just like we have mental models about Americanness. I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with people in Spain and Scotland and England. And actually, I don't have people really outside of those areas. I would love to keep listing other countries. But just every time I come across someone who has this mutual interest, we can share stories about how our own cultures have socialized us into these ideas and what exactly are the critical processes we have to go through to undo that. And by the way, I don't think having a mental model is a bad thing. Like, we literally wouldn't be able to use language without mental models. The idea that our brain can create mental models makes it so we can make quick decisions about things. For instance, if you're driving down the road and all of a sudden you see a bunch of taillights, your mental model can tell you, I've been in that traffic jam before. I know it's going to take me an hour longer to get to work if there's that many taillights. I have a mental model for what those taillights mean. I'm getting off at the next exit and I'm taking a back road. Mental models are how we make decisions. They're so useful. And in fact, without them, we wouldn't even be able to speak any language. We can make complex grammatical structures without even having to think about it, because our brain has those mental representations of language all set up and ready to go. So you're not bad if you have mental models. Those people on Twitter don't even realize what they're doing. They've been socialized into this, and they have not done the personal growth and development that it takes to get out. But you got to grow up. You got to grow past those models, and you got to find something better, and you got to keep growing your whole life.
Well, and it's like you said, especially with the patriotism, Martha mentioned like the pledge in the chat. And I like chuckled to myself because I thought, like, I literally mute Zoom every day in first period because the pledge comes on and I'm like, I don't know what to do. So I'm like, mute, because I have roomies and zoomies at the same time, and I don't want the zoomies to know that we're doing the pledge, because I'm not doing the pledge, because literally nobody is. Like the class just stays sitting, and I'm like, you know, like, I never know what to do or how to handle it, like the first day of school. So I'm like, stand or don't. I'll just and then I'm just like pouring coffee and taking attendance and just like avoiding the whole thing, because it's so uncomfortable the way that so many people can latch on to that when it's literally like it's just it's just a lot to me. And so I like every single day mute it, and then when they say we're ready for like the moment of reflection, which I also think is annoying, then I unmute and I'm like, okay, zoomies, we're reflecting, okay, entonces, you know, and like we just move on. And I wonder if they wonder why it like boops out for a second. But you could, if you were watching the class, and this is probably every class I've ever had since I started teaching, no, they don't stand for the like the kids I have not ever seen. And I've taught in 2 different military communities. My husband was military, he's deployed 3 times. Like we've done all the things, you know, but so those seemingly patriotic gestures, kids literally just want to like sit and still look at Instagram. Like they're not, nobody has seemingly been offended, but that always makes me uncomfortable because of what it represents and like what I think someone could say about me not doing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. So I'm focusing, you know, on just like the aspect of patriotism and multilingualism that is very fresh on my mind. But I see, I'm trying my hardest to kind of scroll through the chat and pick up what's going on there too. And there's a lot of directions that we can take this. I personally do not feel allegiance to the flag, just because in my mind it's a flag and not any sort of a real thing, you know, like allegiance symbols isn't my thing. And it is, it's interesting to see how people make sense of the fact that you can say something that sounds like what they believe, but have symbols and practices that are different. And this is what happens in language classes, whether we like it or not, is students might see, oh, this is a kind of music that I like. It sounds like something I would listen to, but the context seems very different. The is very different. This person is talking about their reality and they seem like someone who might live in my community, but what they're saying about reality is very different. How do they make sense of that? And in my research, it actually can be very small things that sort of start students down the path of disorienting dilemmas is what triggers a lot of times that critical reflection. So part of it is understanding differences, like saying, how come this person is interpreting reality different from me or is experiencing reality different from me? But a lot of it is finding those connections, because if someone is very different from you, I see this on social media again from very good people who have very good intentions, but they say things like, of course that person believes that horrible thing because they are actually a garbage person. Because if we see someone as very different from us, qualitatively very different from us, and we can't find any connection with them, it actually makes it really easy to discount what they say. On the other hand, if we see someone as very connected to us and very similar to us, then those differences suddenly become salient. Like, how can they be so similar to me, but also engage in this thing differently? So finding ways to connect our students with what is ostensibly different will encourage them to explore those differences more, which will sort of trigger some critical responses.
Yeah. Well, and it sounds like what you're saying too is empathy based, because you've got to understand, you know, it's like when you look at, again, like you said, socialized, born, raised, you know, here in the US, and you look at some of those really depressed areas that, you know, tend to be who, you know, politically the last 4 years, they probably were very happy and things like that. I look at the town I grew up in, you know, in the like middle of nowhere, Midwest. And I mean, like so many depressed businesses, so many disenfranchised people, so many people looking for someone to blame. And the person that they're blaming is someone who's not from here or took their job or those kind of things. And I think that's where a lot of those comments come from. It like is like that hurt and that inability to articulate what really happened, because that's what they feel happened. That really is their truth, and they're lashing out in the same ways that those people on Twitter were as well.
Yeah.
It's really hard to relate to that, but I think to understand it, I think you have to at least, you have to try.
Yeah. Yes. And I will also say that one of the things that I think often goes wrong with this sort of work is it's fun to talk about cultural differences. Like, it's engaging. And so on some level, I'm like, yes, I know we all want to engage our students, but showing them all these amazing, titillating things that aren't like them in some ways is doing us a disservice. In a lot of ways, is doing us a disservice, because we want them to be titillated and entertained by the human beings we're studying, or do we want them to feel connected? So this is another way that these mental models, this life learning, is just like language acquisition. Language acquisition, from your first language to your second, it is a product of love and trust. And I wouldn't even use the word empathy. I would say affection. Children learn language because they trust the people they're communicating want to hear what they have to say. And they love the people they're communicating with so much that they want to understand what those people are saying.
Wow.
First language acquisition is really built on nurturing, socialized relationships of love and trust. And so second language acquisition tends to get a little further away from that, where we're not, well, I don't know. I think the trend now is to be very affectionate with our students and maybe engage in more trust-based activities with students. Traditionally, that's not the kind of words we use to talk about classroom experiences. But when you love someone and when you trust someone, you are more likely to change your mind because they disagree with you. So if we are generating community inside of our classrooms and teaching our students how to build relationships with people who are ostensibly different by finding those connections and commonalities, like you said, building empathy. Actually, some of the research I've done, it's actually a common thread that they did biographical work over heroes in Spanish-speaking communities, or watched a film about heroes in Spanish-speaking communities and felt so much affection for those heroes and the stories that they learned about, that they started saying, wow, they're just like me. I have heroes like that in my community as well. We've been through similar struggles, and started to identify personally with the events that they were learning about in class. Is there any, the chat is going so fast, I have no idea what's happening. Meredith,
I was just about to scroll up. Was it, let's see. Oh, Florencia said, what do you do when students say the class is too political, or they feel like we are imposing our political views on them? Which I totally get. How do you handle it?
Well, one thing is I actually am pretty sensitive to that, because I've mostly, before I came to Vanderbilt, I mostly taught at faith-based institutions. And I think there's an implicit idea in faith-based institutions that we have to show respect for a spectrum of political views in ways that maybe are not, that don't come to me naturally. So one of the things that I do is, when I talk about current events, I focus on the perspectives of the people involved in the events, and I leave my own stuff out of it. So when I talk about current events in my language classroom, it actually doesn't feel political at all. I sort of take a step back from the critical stuff at that point. But let me show you a few examples that I have loaded up here. I'll share my screen again. These are all from We Teach Languages episodes, and I think the three of them together make an interesting study in how you might think about doing this kind of work without crossing the line into alienating students or families.
Totally.
So this is Dr. Priscilla Lane, and she teaches German. And one of the things that she teaches is a Turkish-German course. Cool. So her whole program, and honestly, every mental model everyone on earth has about who Germans are, is like the stereotype of Germanness, right? Her whole program is about sort of the mainstream dominant narrative of Germanness. She teaches a class about Turkish German texts because when she first started reading Turkish German texts, she felt such a strong connection to the stories of immigration and courage that those texts were telling, that she wanted her students to also have access to them. So Turkish German communities aren't the same as other German communities. They don't speak the same variety of language. They have their own vernacular. So she says, I come from a family of immigrants. I was the first one in the family born in the US. So when I first read Turkish German texts, I think they really spoke to me because they thematized the immigrant experience. Now, in most college programs, we don't have a lot of control of what the whole program looks like. But in this one course, she's given students permission to do a deep dive into the Turkish German experience, to see the world through their eyes, to read texts that they have written, to learn language the way they would speak it, and to ignore this sort of weird dictate that all the language we use has to be that 100% universal variety that is a myth. It's a myth that there's 100% universal variety of any language.
Right.
This is an exclusive variety that only some people are speaking, exclusive text that only some people are reading. And she's giving students in her program permission to do a deep dive on that. She's doing it because she connected it with her personal experience and developed that affection for that community. And now she's giving her students the chance to do the same.
Wow.
Here's another one. I don't know if y'all listened to this episode with Regina.
Yes.
I don't know, is Regina here tonight?
Fantastic.
Her entire course highlights Black culture and Black people in the Spanish-speaking world. Her entire course. She is not there to teach you about the stereotype that students already have in their head or what they've already learned in other textbooks, or even very important, interesting information about other communities. She is there with a singular focus, which is to help her students, who are mostly Black students, and she is a Black teacher, help them connect with a specific community. So this goes back to those tweets again. Why does the Spanish she teach have to be 100% universal variety? That's some prestigious variety that everyone buys into. Why? She can teach anything she wants, and she chooses to teach about Black people. Love it. Here's another one. Matthew Griffin wrote a paper last year about the pronoun vos in Spanish and how it's used in quite a few Spanish-speaking countries. Some countries, it's just a regular everyday form. And in some countries, it's almost stigmatized and users maybe feel it's not a proper form in the language. But in all the textbooks that he analyzed in his study, none of them were teaching it as a grammatical form. None of them were teaching it as part of the language, maybe as a cultural oddity, but never as a part of the language. Many of those same textbooks were teaching vosotros, which is only spoken in one country. And so why, particularly thinking about multilingual Spanish speakers in our Spanish courses, what are we communicating to the Spanish speakers in our community, in our school, when our textbooks and our programs and our curriculum are teaching this 100% variety, which, you know, obviously that's a myth. There's no 100% variety, but we're teaching it as if somehow it's a default. When, what if I made a choice that this year I'm going to learn vos and my students are going to learn vos, and that's all we're going to do, that we're going to do vos. We're not going to do tú or vosotros this year, just vos. What if we did that? That would be amazing. Students are going to learn tú and vosotros in someone else's class. Trust me.
Trust me.
What if I did this? Yeah.
I remember, I think it was actually in Tennessee, like at a TFLTA, hearing one lady gasp when I said that I didn't know vosotros. Like I've never learned it because I never had to. And I was like an older lady, like, and I was like, what? You know, like, what was that? You know, it was like, because I think she literally couldn't believe, like, but then how do you teach the Spanish? You know, and I was like,
Yeah.
I would literally have to make up, you could hold a gun to my head right now and I wouldn't know any of the conjugations. I would just make them up. I'm like, eyes with an accent over something. Like, I don't know. It would be bad.
I mean, that's actually good. You did it. That was it.
Yeah. Like, see, but where's the accent? Over the A, or is there one?
It doesn't matter. There's no accent marks in spoken communication. So we're good.
By lice, I literally don't know. And like you said, they can learn it somewhere else, or like, or go and live in Spain and never need it. You know what I mean? Like everyone, no one blinked an eye.
The thing is, like 99.9% of Spanish taught in the US, and I know that there's teachers of other languages here, and I don't mean to exclude you, I apologize, but 99.9% of the language taught in the US excludes vos.
Right.
So like if I decide I'm going to teach vos, that doesn't change the flow of the like overwhelming mental model of what Spanish is and how it's taught, right? I'm not actually affecting the big picture, but I can tell my students, hey, I've made a choice for the forms and varieties we're going to use in class. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. And I'm doing it so that you'll have an opportunity to really critically think about what forms of your own language are spoken by you, by other people, what are the differences there? And let's really dig deep into a particular variety. This is a side note, but it drives me crazy when textbooks or programs or curriculum will try to hit like 22 Spanish speaking countries in a 1-year course. Like that's not diversity. Doing a surface level reinforcing of stereotypes for every country that we come to is not diversity. But really talking about how you are and sharing your own language, your own culture, own experiences, finding individuals from the culture that you can do biographical study of and really get to know them and their forms. Like that is diversity. That's giving us real access to language.
There's a great Instagram account. Let me grab, I was just posting some stuff to our class Instagram today that does this great series called, there's two things that he's got one, I think it's a male artist that says like it's got like the invisible history of, and then Spanish speaking country, but invisible's crossed out. And he's got a series that says the Black history of like Brazil is one of them. And then he's got the Black history of Puerto Rico and the Black history of Palenque, Colombia, and all these different places. And there was a reason that popped into my head just now to share that with you, and it has escaped me because it's 2021. Well, what did you just say? What was the point? Dang it.
I already forgot what I just said though, so we're in a lot of trouble.
For the recording. Joe, put something in the chat. Dang it. No, there was a point. Anyway, it's a really cool account. I'll pop the name in the chat, but there was a point to that. Boop, boop, boop. What did you just say? Oh, yeah, as opposed to like our book, I know, which I've seen like once, has like a country per unit, you know, that kind of thing. But it's that pretend culture. It's that like, okay, do the map drawing, do the capitals, do the flag, let's talk about Las Fallas, and then like you said, move on, like you go too quickly, instead of let's focus on like, who aren't we talking about? You know, whose history is, you know, whatever, masked in some way or excluded. And I find those to be also, like you said, with the intentional use of vos, like we're gonna do this thing, let's see what happens, just taking a deeper dive.
Yeah. So one thing that I do, and I like to highlight other people's examples because I maybe don't go all in as much as other people. Like I love the Turkish German and the entire course around Black culture, language and culture. But one of the things that I do is we do a lot of biography study in my classes. So every week there's a couple people that are Spanish speakers, and I'm not going to say that are native Spanish speakers because I like to make sure that my students know that you can learn Spanish as a second language, or you can be an immigrant in a Spanish language community and you're still someone in the target language community that we want to learn from and get to know. So I include a variety of Spanish speakers throughout the course, and I am very careful in who I select to make sure that they don't reinforce my students' pre-existing mental models. So Laura Abreu, once again, I interviewed her for the podcast way back in episode 12. She did a study of what students think of when they think of a Spanish speaker. And it was what you might think. It was like sort of stereotypical Spanish speaker that you might see painted on the side of a Mexican restaurant or something like that.
Yep.
And so after I read her study, I thought, you know, how much of the time in an effort to be balanced, I was like, incorporate more diversity in the target language speakers I focus on. I just need to ditch that. These students already have stereotypical representations baked in. I have stereotypical representations baked in. They don't need any reinforcement. Every single person that we study has to defy our expectations in some way, in the hopes that after a first semester Spanish class, those expectations will be greatly expanded. And it will not be surprising at all to find that Spanish speakers actually represent a variety of locations, a variety of proficiency levels, a variety of ethnic and racial backgrounds, et cetera.
Right. It reminds me of what LJ said. I think in that same presentation, I think maybe most recent, like maybe Act Full, whenever that was, I remember sitting on the floor, I think with Maris. Actually, Maris was like across the way and you guys were presenting, but I remember LJ saying something about, he was talking about curriculum, but then he added in like, and he was talking as himself, can I teach a colonized curriculum? 100%. Like no one just by, race or where they're from or whatever, like is like immune to it. Like, we're all like working on all the things all the time. And again, like you said, with language, it's not a given, or so it seems. That really stuck out to me when he said that. I was like, oh, wow. Yeah. Like you can totally reinforce the same stereotypes that I might, like, we're just as easily capable of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I just noticed that Justin put something in the chat, I think questioning whether a more specific focus would remove the threat of stereotypes, and absolutely not. You're right, Justin. You can go super deep. You can study one person for a whole semester and nothing else and still reinforce existing dominant narratives and be stereotypical. Totally possible. And one of the things in that presentation that Dory Conlon-Perugini said was that picking authentic resources like that represent materials made by target language speakers for target language speakers, that doesn't absolve you from having to take a critical approach either.
That's true.
Some of the steps that I take are not reinforcing my students' existing mental models. I don't know exactly what my students' mental models are. And as the teacher, they probably won't be talking to me about that stuff anyway. But I have an idea just because I live here of what kinds of things are in the air. And so not reinforcing those in my classroom is one step that you can take. Another step that you can take is really focusing on connections. The differences are going to come out, but developing love and trust within your community of learners and extending that out to other people that you're studying about is really important. And a third is giving students a chance to make meaning. Meaning is central in language teaching, right? We're always talking about how to help students make meaning of language, making language meaningful, not giving them language without also making sure they have meaning to go with it. Meaning is essential to all kinds of learning. So if your students are taking all this stuff in, but they're not pausing every once in a while to make meaning from it, to say, how is this defying my expectations or challenging my assumptions? Have I interacted with people in the past in a way that I don't want to continue? I'd like to make different choices moving forward. For me, those three steps are sort of the entry points to a more critical approach. But I'm very careful not to let down my guard because I was socialized by wonderful people in a wonderful community who loved me and wanted the best for me, but they had mental models that they passed on. My community has its issues that it has passed on to me. And the only way I can effectively be a language teacher without knowing that I'm propagating all that stuff is by constantly taking moments to evaluate my own work, to make meaning for myself. Is what I'm doing helping my students grow and develop, see the world in a more critical light, do more of that assumption and questioning work that they need to do? Or am I so focused on sort of other things that are probably valuable too, but am I so focused on other things that I'm unintentionally just reinforcing?
That came up on Tuesday with, Tuesday or Monday. Maybe Monday with Ying Jin. I was, I had this resource that I loved and used in the past. And then this year I kind of thought, ooh, like it was, oh shoot, Kelly, I'm going to need the name again. What was it? Guanjero? Google something, would you? It takes a village, everybody. I can't remember, but it's the children in Guatemala who like their livelihood is in those like trash, like the dumps, the city, like the trash areas in the city. Guajeros. Okay, I was darn close. Why do I add an N every time? That's weird. Anyway, and I had this super cute activity. Right, there's the word. There's the problem. Cute, right? Like that. But it was cute, and I had a colleague say, "Do you ever come back to like Guatemala? Yeah, like is that the only thing they see in Guatemala?" Because in my mind, in purchasing the resource, it was a purchased resource like within a larger curriculum. It was a really well done, like, so there's a lot of problems here, listen.
Yeah.
So like, it was really simplified Spanish and they could understand a really complex, it was beautifully phrased and really, really well scaffolded and all the things. However, you know, A, that was the only message I ever sent about Guatemala. And B, what's maybe worse about that is I felt good about that resource because I thought it you know, kind of put a light on another aspect, or so. It was like more deeply cultural in my mind than again just capital flags, foods, you know, all the whatever. I was like, no, this is like legitimately cultural. But then never revisited Guatemala. I've never been to Guatemala. Like all of these things. So there was nothing in my mind. What I thought was authentic was really not, and also a little bit tropey, like probably perpetuates like, oh, these poor children, like these poor brown children live in the garbage, but they're happy, like that kind of BS thing that we see in a lot of ways. And now I look back, I'm like, it was the opposite of my intention, but totally the 100% the impact. 100%.
Right. And I think there's a couple of additional questions I have about that resource, which is were the Guatemalan children speaking for themselves or was someone writing about them?
Absolutely.
And we actually get to know the way they see the world and hear how they're advocating for themselves and how they're experiencing their lives. Or was it sort of descriptive ethnographic information and then move on? Because it can be really damaging to portray communities in need of rescuing, like poor garbage children, right?
Poor garbage children.
But it is actually possible to talk about the harsh realities of different communities. Like we don't have to shelter our students from injustice. It's just if we're talk about injustice in other communities, I think we should be connecting it to injustices in our own communities. So is there, there definitely are, is there a section of my community where reclaiming trash is helping people to make a livelihood and making the community better because it's reducing the amount of trash? Who are those people? Are they advocating for themselves? Are they speaking for themselves? Can I make a connection between what happens here and what happens in other places so that my students aren't just seeing this as some exotic thing that happens someplace else, but can make a real community connection across cultures? I love the thing about, did you ever come back to Guatemala and show a fuller picture of Guatemala? Also, I'm definitely guilty of that also.
100%. And especially if it's a place, you know, as a non-native speaker in a place I've never visited, I'm like, well, I don't know, this seems like a thing that's true. I feel like I'm constantly like looking in to so many cultures in, you know, the Spanish speaking world that it's, you know, like it's like, can I speak to this? Should I speak to this? Bethany Drew has a great, because she's freaking amazing, in North Carolina, does a great thing. I think it's with garbage, but it might be with clothing. Anyway, she does this whole like recycling thing, and it's the cultural, it's getting rid of something. It's like cultural pieces of, and I want to say she brings in guajeros or something like that, and then brings it back to their community. Like there's some kind of local effort that she then contributes to. So it's like the mindset behind, kind of like what you just mentioned, like the mindset behind the thing. And then it's more of like cultural comparison kind of thing. Totally what I should have done. So I need to like steal that from her and hope it's cute. No, I'm kidding. Cute, overrated. But
it's okay for things to be cute as long as we're honest about how critical it is. Yeah.
But she does amazing stuff of like let's talk about this, let's talk about this, let's talk about this. I think as teachers, I think we get so busy sometimes that easy takes a precedent, and this is not an excuse, but easy takes a precedent, cute sometimes takes a precedent. You know, it's cute to put llamas all over everything because llamas are the friggin' cutest, but then not to look at like, you know, the deeper things under
Meredith,
llamas and the
I
top.
got really brutally spit on by a llama a couple years ago, and I just don't like them anymore.
Right. They just
Not
don't.
a fan.
One's really close. He was hissy and then he like backed up, and so they're still cute.
So
yeah.
I guess to sort of wind up my thoughts here, whenever I talk about these things, I feel a lot of imposter syndrome. And I know I've emphasized that at various points here, but I am an imperfect teacher who's doing the best I can. And one of the ways that I am trying to improve my own practice is by specifically researching how language and culture is learned and how students learn, interact with languages and cultures in a way that's better, in a way that's more critical and helps them grow as people. And so I love to keep talking about this. And if anyone wants to finish this conversation on social media, I'm definitely up for that. I would love to hear what you're doing that's working. But I feel very strongly that our students deserve to understand how rich and diverse and beautiful the world is. I feel very strongly that the actual point of education isn't to be able to communicate across difference or to run a good company or to be a multilingual lawyer. I think the actual purpose of the education we give students in languages is so that they can love people better. And so starting from that very squishy place that this is not a transaction, this is you're opening up the world. You're going to be your full authentic self, and you're going to meet people, and you're going to be able to communicate with them by decentering your own perspective and really making an attempt to shed your own socialization and understand where someone else is coming from. I think that these are just such high ideals that I will never personally live up to them. But that's what my work is about, is trying to get there and learning from other people who are working towards that as well. I know that my approach is very squishy and that it doesn't resonate with everyone, and that's okay too. But I want my students to love better, to love more openly, to love more completely. And I want them to know that language is how we do that with each other.
I agree. I think we're just coming off the heels of Language Advocacy Day, and Joe and I were talking earlier about the reasons that we give to further our programs and to further language and to advocate, are sometimes problematic in like national defense. What are we defending ourselves against?
No, I don't want you to shoot people better. I want you to love people better.
Love people, just love them, right? And I think sometimes we forget, we say like, for our students to have a love of travel, like we have all these extrinsic things, and I think I think you're exactly aligned with a lot of with what a lot of us maybe don't. I don't know. It does feel squishy to articulate it that way, but like, damn it, like languages make it like it's just it can be a self-love thing, it can be a love the world thing. Like they just open up all these different kind of maybe not tangible, really valuable things in life, and maybe for some that's the only reason they need not study abroad or college credit, whatever. I mean, at some point sometimes the squishy stuff is good enough and is the best stuff, I think.
Well, I work at a university and students are choosing their majors, and so I get a lot of like first year pre-med students in my first semester class, right? And they're like, I'm going to be a doctor and I'm going to change the world. And then they experience a course that they've never had to take before. And they say, universally, they say, I decided to drop my pre-med major because I fell in love with this thing I'd never seen before. Wow. I decided to change track because I fell in love. Like falling in love with a discipline, with a major, with a possibility for your future is language I hear from students almost exclusively when they talk about why they're making decisions about their future. I know that some people are very practical about things, but I don't think that anyone is so practical that they're not really thinking with their emotions, thinking with the possibility of having a good future.
Well, they sure are when they change their mind. You know, when they stop taking when they stop taking language classes, and because somebody, you know, beat the fun out of it or made it all conjugations, like they emotionally remember that when they go, oh, I hated my French, and you're like, okay, well, you know, whatever. So yeah, I think you're right on. Yay. Stacey, thank you so much. I hope we haven't, you're in Central Time, right? So we haven't.
I'm in Central Time, and my 17-year-old son is cooking hamburgers for dinner. He's an amazing cook. And so as soon as I get off, I'm going down to eat hamburgers with my babes.
It's hamburger time. Is this if you don't mind, because you've mentioned it on social media, is this I guess all three of yours are teens, right? Guys, that's crazy.
Well, yeah, 2 teens and an 11-year-old.
Yeah. On the break.
We go through a lot of groceries.
I was gonna say, how are they doing with school? I know you've mentioned on social media, like the transition to virtual has been positive in some ways. Is it still? Is that?
Well, we've been really locked down here, and my big boys miss their friends and their girlfriends and their independence and being able to get in a car and drive somewhere except for around the neighborhood.
Yeah, right. Take it around the block.
Miss being grown.
Yep.
But they've been doing it, and school's going really well. But my youngest has had an absolutely amazing remote experience. He was in many ways just tortured in his schooling experiences up until now. It was just miserable for him. It was miserable for me.
Wow.
He's not white as I'm white. He is not. And so he experienced a lot of things in school that I never did, and honestly did not realize school was like for an African-American boy. And I am intensely regretful that I did not take the time to understand that until it happened to my own family. It's yet another way that I have lived up to my own ideals. But a lot of those things have been issues since we've been in virtual school.
Yeah.
He is allowed all the benefits of getting an education without all of the mess that came with it. And we love virtual school. We love it. We're hoping we'll get to continue with virtual school after everything goes back to whatever it's going to go back to. I don't want to say normal, but goes to something new.
Yeah, I had one today that I felt compelled to email and say, dude, you're killing it. Like I know this is not easy because, you know, whatever, virtual anything isn't always easy. Even, you know, graduate classes at an online level are hard. So much motivation and so many multiple factors, but I was like, man, he like got his quiz done early and like this, that, and the other. And I was like, okay, not gonna lie, you're like a machine. You're on top of it. Like I was super proud of you, whatever. And if you were back, he was like, oh, thanks so much, whatever. Like, it's so weird that this time last year I was paneled at our school. Paneled's like about to go to alternative school. So like you've been paneled, you've been like, it's like the language is all screwy. It's like you're like convicted, like you're found guilty in your panel.
Yeah.
Like, it's like adult language for, anyways, a lot of minor offenses. But
school to prison pipeline.
Yeah, 100%. Like, yes, absolutely. And so he was paneled, but then the pandemic happened. So they never actually had his panel hearing. So he like wasn't sent to alternative school. So then they chose virtual, you know, this, that, and the other. And he's like, it's crazy. Like a year ago, I was paneled, and like he, you know, would have like historically would have been in a couple of fights by now. Like just all this noise and all this distraction, coupled with, exactly like you said, an experience that is, you know, different from other students all around him and different from my experience and so on. And he was just like, yeah, this is nuts. Like I'm just at home learning, doing my thing. I'm like, see, we talk about how miserable this is for so many students, but I'd love to loop into those conversations, the students who are really thriving and who are really like winning in a lot of ways, not doing well, because no one's doing well. Like this is all still, but
right.
Like maybe,
yeah, it's still a pandemic.
It's still a pandemic. Like it's still kind of a disaster, but like doing as well as can be expected, and maybe probably feeling fulfilled in some ways that they weren't before in like traditional school because of how it's built and who it's catered to.
Yeah.
Which I think is
I'm sorry, did you say something?
No.
So last year in February, we were planning on going on a family vacation and then having spring break, and we were seriously considering that he might not be mentally able to go back to fourth grade after spring break because things were at such a breaking point. His elementary school took away recess as a punishment for not bringing your homework to school.
Mhm.
And for not bringing homework, and like if he didn't take notes in math class, he would get his recess taken away that afternoon. Is pretty brutal. And he had just been months without a recess, without being able to eat lunch in the lunchroom with his friends. He always had to eat with a teacher or with the officer, the resource officer. I mean, just absolutely a brutal experience. And I tried everything I knew how to do as a parent, like nice emails and sending research and walking in with my hair on fire and losing my ding dang mind and everything I think to do to advocate for him. I was at the end of my rope. And when the pandemic hit and all the kids got sent home, we were cheering. We were like, yay!
Later. Right.
Out. Maybe we'll never have to go back.
Later, losers, don't door hit you. You know, you're like, yes. And the teachers too.
Yes.
I just said in the chat too, like we don't talk about the teachers who were having maybe the worst year of their career or going through a really challenging, trying time. And like March 13th, like we all know that date, right? Friday the 13th, that 16th, when for so many of us, school was like came to a halt and went online. Let's talk about who else breathed a sigh of relief, you know, was like, not just to stay home and like wear elastic and gain 10 pounds. I mean, that was my agenda, but like, you know,
that has been fun.
But it has been fun, and the weight's not going to keep itself on. So I'll just keep doing it. But I mean, truly, like who went, because that, like Kelly just said in the chat, like normal, quote unquote, sucked for a lot of people, like a lot of kids and a lot of adults. And maybe even, you know, I don't know, also roping in like teachers, if the only thing that's kept you coming back every day this year is having better boundaries, like maybe this is a turning point and maybe now you just leave at contract time all the time, or just keep work email deleted off of insert device here, you know, that kind of a thing. Like, why weren't we carving space for some of these things before? I mean, we know why, but yeah, I think that's the experience of many people, is school going virtual, and it's like, it's a respite. Yeah. Well, I know
we all found this little oasis. Well, I have already started writing emails because I enjoy sending emails with my thoughts, my our kids' teachers. I'm usually quite nice about it, but I'm like, hey, I had an interesting thought. What do you think about this? And so I've already started sending emails to people saying, you know, virtual schools worked out so well for so many families. What are the chances that our local zone schools are going to continue having a virtual option for the teachers, students that actually feel like, nah, we're good, we're not going back?
Yeah, it's been fun, but it hasn't. I'll stay home. Yeah.
Anyway.
100%. Well, and I think it's forced a lot of teachers to do a lot of things that we could have blamed before on time or energy or resources, like, post my lesson plans. That's a lot of work, you know, or whatever. And now because we have to, I'm like, dang, I have all of levels 1 and 2 lessons, like resources. They're now all in one place. Why wasn't I doing that before? Retakes, redos, kids can just like click, resubmit, rock and roll. A lot of the things I was doing before, I know, not intentionally, but nonetheless, were conditional upon transportation, time, you know, like, oh, you can redo that quiz, Stacey, just come after school on Tuesdays. Oh, you can't do Tuesdays? I can't do Wednesdays. And now we're, you know, negotiating back and forth. Why wasn't that like an online option?
Oh, Martha just said in the chat that her district is offering remote schooling next year.
Wow.
So I'm going to use that as an example in my email to my son's principal later today.
And Martha Silva said that her...
I know for a fact that some schools are offering remote options next year.
For a fact. Right. I know this thing. I've asked about ours. I've said, like, can our mainstream, like our introductory level language, chemistry, algebra, like the things that everyone takes, you know, kind of a thing, are they going to have like an online option? And I've kind of been given like a wishy-washy answer, but I'm like, I would do online Spanish 1 and 2 because it would be a community teacher, not just the plug and play Duolingo district thing that students get, but like an actual teacher at your school. I think that would be incredibly powerful to know that there's someone giving you feedback, and you can pack more kids into a class virtually because you're not, I'm used to 36 in the room, but you could put 40 or 50, and virtually.
Why would you say that out loud? Take that back immediately.
I want
Smaller
6
class sizes are better. Meredith.
I want no more than 10. Pack them in. You could do so much and serve so many more kids in like a personal way, that your school, like that's a local school, like you were just saying, kind of a thing that I think that would be really cool. Our kids right now typically only get online language if they're on the edges, if you're like graduating early or if you're in alternative school. And I think that's super unfair and just like sends all the wrong messages. Like this is, oh, you want to get ahead and get it out of the way? Great. Oh, you still have to complete this requirement? Okay. But you made all these bad choices or whatever. I would love for it just to be like, yeah, you took Spanish online, but like with your school teacher. I think that would be cool.
I don't want to harp on this whole mental models thing too much, but one of the reasons why teachers are able to improve their practices when there's some sort of a catastrophic event like this is because there's an inertia around doing things the way we know works or the way we've been told works. We have this idea that this practice aligns with this outcome, this practice aligns with this outcome, and we get like a one-to-one correlation between I do this and this happens, I do this and this happens. And so even if reality is showing us that it doesn't happen for all students and it doesn't happen all the time and it's not actually working as well as we want it to, our mental model is not reflecting reality. It's making us interpret reality that way. So we keep doing those same things, but doing them harder, doing them more, spending more of our spare time doing them until we've driven ourselves absolutely crazy because our mental models have us stuck in this rut. So and those are hard to break out of. But a pandemic comes along, you get sent home, you are basically inventing everything from scratch. Your mental models don't work at all. So now all you have is just concrete evidence through your senses to determine what works and what doesn't.
Right. You're out of models. It's like, what do I do? I don't have anything. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and like Kelly said, if the kids actively choose online, in the future or whatever, then the engagement piece of that might look different because right now they're, they may not really be choosing this. And to me, that's also that mental model, for someone who's just hating this, but maybe hasn't found efficient ways of doing things, that therefore it's more work. Therefore they're hating virtual teaching because this is what they think this is. That might not even be convincing for them because they're like, no, I'm never doing that again. Get me back to, real, whatever, in-person teaching or normal, what it was before.
Yeah, what worked.
Yeah.
One of the things I like to do when things aren't working for me, but I realize I'm stuck in this rut and I can't think my way out of it because my mental models are keeping me in one place, is I imagine kicking it all together. So I did this with feedback on Twitter a couple months ago, and there was just a huge discussion over several days that was really important and transformative for me personally. But I just put it out on Twitter. Hey, what do y'all think about the idea that maybe giving feedback is like a waste of time and we shouldn't be doing it? We shouldn't be giving any feedback.
I feel like I remember this tweet. I feel like I was like, more.
Yeah, and people just discussed it. And the more people discussed it, the more questions I had, the more I was able to really narrow in, take a critical approach and think, okay, well, this person is pushing back. What does that mean? And it was honestly fantastic. And it was one of the most formative things that I've done about feedback. And it was because I said, I'm just going to toss this mental model and bring some other people into the conversation and see what happens.
Right. Like thoughts, and it's so interesting to hear so many different thoughts. To me, those are the best parts of social media, or when you're like, ooh, yes. Okay. Yes. Oh, I like that. Ooh, I don't, why do I hate that? Like that, that kind of consideration, because you can get so much input so quickly, and that could be so powerful. I remember that tweet.
It was a good one. It'll be gone soon because I delete my tweets after a month or two. And so like, it's probably a distant memory now. It's probably not even.
Crap. It's probably gone. Quick tag us in it or something. I want to read again. Yeah. But again, if you're frustrated, if you're looking at the kind of feedback and you're just questioning any of the efficacy that it's ever had, that can be so powerful, because it's like, it's that thing where get a room of language teachers together and talk about corrective feedback, which the science behind is not super supportive of. when they're not motivated.
Science is kind of meh.
Right. Like when they're not motivated for it, it's like, who cares? But the whole, the room goes, oh, you're telling me, because we've all been there where we spent 4 hours, circling and highlighting and underlining, then we give it back and they go, oh, 83, cool, thanks, and throw it away. No malintent.
Okay. But if you're stuck in that mental model, then you're going to say, oh, maybe I don't just ditch corrective feedback. Maybe I give more. Maybe I force them to read it and write a reflective essay on my corrective feedback. Maybe I make this such a huge, unwieldy thing that we all hate it. That'll work.
That's it. 100%. 100%. Like it's like that lesson when you're like it's going flat and nobody's doing the thing and kids are all distracted. And you're like, oh, okay, you're not going to do what I'm doing. Now it's a grade, and now it's like, if you didn't care before, you're going to super care now. That's
yes, I have just raised the stakes so high. We will all look back on this day in fear.
I want all of you to hate this experience as much as I am right now.
Oh my gosh. And I got to say, this is me with parenting also. I'm like, oh, you're going to defy my expectations? There's nothing I can do about it, but make life miserable for everyone in this house.
But I will be incorrigible. No, 100%. I don't know. I think that's a lot of people's parenting. I don't think you're allowed to that. My parents, 100%. Yeah. Like, oh, is that your choice? I'm like, no, not anymore.
Oh, I have wonderful children who constantly are looking for ways to break my mental models. I like to say they're my little Zen Buddhist priests because they have separated me from my attachment to all of my physical possessions. They're all broken now, so thanks.
Yep.
They have separated me from my need to have any control. I don't. They run everything. I just work here.
Yep.
They have
pay the bills.
Important figures in my critical journey.
Right.
Well, I'm really grateful to everyone who was here tonight and contributed to the chat. And I am going to read the chat really thoroughly after this because I want to talk to all of you, but I'm not good at reading and talking at the same time.
I can
send you on social media and start conversation.
And I can send, I know Martha was, and Maris, and I think Joe as well, and maybe Kelly as well, like, we're tweeting, and I'll send you the chat afterwards. I can send you the chat transcript. If you guys want to drop any like handles you have, thanks for staying for the after party. If you want handles or like any email addresses or any kind of like contact point, because as we go back through and you guys can see, you can see like, oh, okay, this was Martha, okay, so on and so forth. That'd be awesome. Because then it'll come through as like a text file. But let me know if it doesn't open. I know some it doesn't open. Yay.
Joe, I want you to know that I just scrolled up to the very top of the chat and read your comment that she's absolutely beautiful. And even though I know you're talking about Maris's daughter, I'm just going to tuck that away as a compliment for me. And I really
right. Like, dang, nailed it. I just want to say I've had 2 smoothies this week that specifically were skin enhancing, and then Joe complimented my skin earlier today. So I think it's just oily. I think at this point I'm just like greasy from the day, but I'll take it as like dewy. So just we're all